We're live.
Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome back to Pro Democracy Pod. I'm here with my co-host Alex Rubenstein, and we have a special guest today from Twink Revolution named Sam. You might recognize him from Twink Revolution, from his articles, or from Twitter. Hey Sam, how's it going?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. We're very excited to have you. We have talked a little bit on this show and, out in context outside of the show of the use of progressive language to further imperialism. Alex in particular has a very good piece on his Substack about intersectional imperialism, but we haven't quite narrowed in on the LGBT element. And that's something that you're close to and very familiar with, and you've done a historical survey of that through your series in the Galag Archipelago. So I guess I'll start off by just asking you to explain your series.
Yeah, so it's a name making fun of Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, which is like a right-wing attack on the Soviet Union and Stalin. And basically, I got the idea from a German guy I met who told me there was this gay club he found out was created during the German Democratic Republic, the socialist East German state. And I was like, oh, I had no idea. I just thought all of it was kind of still horrible for the gays in all of these countries. And I started looking into different countries, and I was like, this would be a really cool series. So I've done a few episodes on basically in historical order of when they took power, and it's basically going through the histories of them and how sexual and gender rights have evolved in the different countries. So I did the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, and what was the other one? GDR. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, something that we hear a lot, I guess, even something I believed for a bit was that, especially Cuba, these communist countries were uniquely homophobic. And you always hear the sort of talking point about Che Guevara being a homophobic murderer. And the way that they portray it is kind of like he was literally out there hunting for gays. Clearly, some people, a lot of our listeners probably know that's not the case, but how do you sort of respond to these kinds of allegations?
Yeah, I mean, I was one of those people for so long, especially my libertarian days before I got into Marxism and stuff. I was like, oh, Cuba just hated the gays. But when you look into it, they legalized same-sex relations before most states in the U.S. It was up until the early 2000s when the last sodomy laws were taken off the books. So I'm like, how are we going to compare apples to oranges, especially when the U.S. is so much more developed along the path of capitalism, while Cuba, while richer than all of its neighbors, is still far beyond what we've achieved in industrial production, which obviously has an effect on cultural production.
Yeah, it seems like there's kind of a divide that I've noticed in LGBT activism, where it's there's the recognition component where it's just people just being told they're valid, and you have you want to be represented everywhere. Versus, people who are tackling the material struggles faced by the LGBT community. I know in Canada, housing is a big problem. What do you think that there's a sort of disconnect when you look at the sort of historical struggles that LGBT people have faced? Do you notice anything today that stands out that, might seem like it's moving in a direction unfavorable? Or I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think LGBT rights, that's what I'm going to call it, is I think it had its purpose, especially early on, where it was heavily focused on fighting the feudal nature of most of like Western Europe and like the US, where religion played a big role. And basically, as liberalism came up and capitalism, they kind of fought back against it via like legalism and things like psychiatry and like medicalization of sexuality, which is where the modern LGBT rights movement kind of originates, is through medicalization and like legalism, and it emerged in Germany. But I think today it's mostly serving a purpose to basically keep the working class separate and focus on issues that don't really unite us. Like you mentioned housing, and LGBT people will use that, or activists will say, well, we need to fight for gay housing or trans housing. But it's like, housing is needed by everyone. Why do we have to make it focused on this one specific group who has very little political sway, except for like advocating for like Democrats if you're in the US? So I think it's mostly just a tool by the elites to keep us divided. I don't really see a lot of utility anymore in most of like highly industrialized countries.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I've actually never been to Pride ever. I've like wanted to go, but have never been. But it definitely seems to have a contested function. You kind of see this with the debate about whether police should be at Pride or not, and certain debates about, you know, whether kink should be at Pride. And I think there's a sort of conflict at play about like what its purpose is. And I kind of remember a friend of both our shows, Esperanza, bringing up the fact that, like, well, guys, there's like corporate floats in this parade everywhere. Like, why are we just talking about the police? And so I wonder what your thoughts are on that. Like, do you think that it is now, do you think it's outlived its purpose, or that it has a different purpose now, or what was its initial purpose?
So I think Pride is kind of like a mystified version of how gay rights emerged. I think it kind of is used to take away, for one, the communist and socialist and even like progressive like bourgeois trends in early gay rights, which emerged in Europe, primarily Germany. But it makes it seem like it started in like the 70s during Stonewall, which isn't the case, because there's an entire US history as well, which were led by mostly like communist gay men, with the Mattachine Society. But I think it's basically, yeah, I don't think it served. I think it needs to be go. Everyone wants to reform it, and I think Pride is done. It's over.
Cancel
like,
Pride.
Yeah, cancel Pride. That's my demand. I mean, it's fine if you want to party for like a day. That's great. I don't really give a. Can I swear on here?
Oh yeah.
I don't give a shit if they like party. Like that's fine, because like with like so many other like lame parties you can do. I don't think it's anything special anymore. I think in many ways it's actually just used now in the imperialism way to promote things like Tel Aviv Pride, or condemning like this Eastern Bloc or the Middle East or Africa for not having Pride, while having no recognition of like sexual or cultural attitudes to any of these issues to begin with. Just like, well, this is how we view sexuality and gender and all of that, and we don't understand why the rest of the world doesn't agree with us. And like, Pride's the way we show we won rights. Like, obviously, I mean, Goldman Sachs is there. We won. We did it.
You always, like, I always hear people say stuff like, well, Gaza doesn't have a pride parade. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, so if Gaza were to start having a pride parade, would the occupation no longer be justified? Like, is that accurate? Because if so, I mean, we can ship some flags over there.
Well, I really think that the geopolitical angle here is super interesting, because on one hand you have attacks against the Soviet Union, attacks against Cuba for their record on gay rights. Well, Fidel Castro in 2010 took full responsibility and apologized. Now Cuba's a leader in gay rights, a world leader in that regard. You look at Western democracies, right? Like West Berlin, where they were taking children, orphans, and giving them to pedophiles for adoption. You look at South Korea, where in the 1980s they were putting gay people in concentration camps under the military dictatorship. There's a great article that comes to mind, came out in 2016 in Out magazine, where a singer-songwriter, what's his name? Patrick Haggerty. I don't know him. I don't know his songs, but he says, yeah, there was, gay people were being incarcerated, but it was the people that were like against the revolution. It was gay people that were against the revolution. And he says, look, I want to stress that, like, after I can't, because he was part of like a youth militant group that went over to Cuba and worked the fields after the revolution voluntarily, of course. So after he came back from Cuba, he got thrown in a mental institution in DC for being gay. So, you know, there's like all this like, oh, Cuba did this, you know, they were putting gay people in mental institutions, incarcerating them, whatnot. But then he leaves Cuba where he was free and comes back to the US and gets put in a mental institution for being gay. So there's like a total, it's like totally one-sided, right? Where all the wrongdoings of socialist states get amplified, and then everything that the Western democracies did is not. And there's still like conversion therapy here, that's still happening. And you also have to look at like the kind of unique history of Cuba as a colony to understand why. I mean, it doesn't justify it, but to understand like the historical context of why their record initially was not so great on gay rights. So for people who don't know, and hopefully most of our viewers know, Cuba was basically like a casino island, right? So the mafia, specifically the Jewish mafia, mostly, ran the island. And it was not uncommon for young boys to be sex slaves there, young Cuban boys. And so at the time, and this was not unique to Cuba, this is globally, homosexuality was very much linked in the minds of the public with pedophilia, which is, we know that's wrong now, but that was the historical context. And so when they took back their country from Batista, from the mafia, there was kind of a national shame around this issue of their young children being sex slaves. And so that fueled a lot of the public animosity, and I would think government policy around that issue. And again, since then, Fidel Castro has taken full responsibility and apologized. So, you know, they've moved on. We haven't totally, you know, but we still want to talk about this Cuban issue for a cause of regime change today, right?
Right.
Even though this was so long ago, it's totally absurd. So I mean, I really don't know much about gay rights in the Soviet Union, so I'd really like to hear more about that.
Yeah, I mean, touching on to what you said about like Cuba, I mean, so much of the context around these supposed homophobic laws. I'm not saying there was never homophobia within these like mostly like semi-feudal states that were rapidly industrializing and having to overcome religious ideas and all of these things. But I mean, so much of these cases, when you look into them, for one, a lot of them weren't actually because they were gay. They were trying to sabotage the revolution in places like Cuba or the Soviet Union. But also a lot of them were actually religious leaders in the Soviet Union, places like Cuba. A lot of the big famous cases of homophobic court cases or whatever you want to call them were actually like religious leaders, like molesting like young boys. And basically the states were using these cases to kind of crack down on a highly like decadent, corrupt culture of like the church, over to the Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church, or even like in parts of the Soviet Union, because only Ukraine and I believe the Russian area like legalized same-sex attraction once they had the revision of their first criminal code. The rest of it had it criminalized to some extent, but the relations were so different compared to like more industrialized Russia and Ukraine and places like Azerbaijan and like the Stan countries. A lot of it was like pederasty. It was men purchasing boys, kind of like you see in Afghanistan today, where men will like buy and steal young boys because they're so segregated on sex lines. So it's in their mind, it was dealing with real harm happening to young boys or people in the sex trade, like Cuba. If you read early cases about what the gay scene was like in pre-Castro Cuba, everything was just a giant like whorehouse. It was everyone was somewhat exploited or in the sex trade if you were an out gay person, mostly for mob members in the US or foreign European visitors or American visitors. So it's like, I think it's easy to like shame them, but the mindset is like, oh, when you have such an interlocking of trauma and exploitation to people who are same-sex attracted, it seems almost the same thing to many people because they didn't have the same cultural advancement that a lot of Western Europe had, where they dealt with the heavy repression and then the Enlightenment and stuff. So it's like there's a lot of context missing. I mean, the Soviet Union also invested a lot really early on in research. So when Lenin took power and they decriminalized it, there was a lot of academic and intelligentsia freedom into study things like gender and sexuality. They conversed a lot with the Weimar Germany, which was like the epicenter of sexual research, primarily in like gay and like transvestite research, which what like
really that's so shocking to me that Germany would be the epicenter of sexual research.
Yeah,
who'd have thunk?
Yeah, it was the Weimar, and they had this giant institute for sexuality. It was destroyed by the Nazis during the uprisings, but and it was like the largest collection of research and all of this stuff. But they did a lot. They did a lot with the Soviet Union and intellectual debate and discussion. But when it changed, there was a build-up to World War II. More people, there was more desire for people to be born, but also a lot of the people focused on like kind of academic stuff were shifted to do more things that would benefit the masses through like mental health and like medical help and stuff like that. They're like, oh, this is great. You're talking about all these things, but like this country is extremely backwards and we need to actually focus on things like clean water and like basic healthcare. So we're not really going to talk about like sexuality, like medical research and shit right now. Like we're going to focus on what's materially important at that point.
I wonder if like part of the reason why these countries that are antagonistic or like antagonized by the imperial core are like embrace social conservatism or more specifically homophobia because it's being portrayed as a Western, so like that homosexuality is being portrayed as something that like the West has like a sort of exclusive hold on, or like something that comes to mind is I was watching a speech from Syria's president and from Assad. It was not
dictator Mila.
Yeah, sorry, Syria's dictator. I mean,
vampire
whatever you want to call him. I'm not making an endorsement or condemnation here, but I was watching a speech and he said some stuff that was definitely not stuff that, you know, people here could get away saying in politics. I'll just put it that way. About trans people. And more specifically, he was trying to ridicule the West by invoking this. So he would say some stuff like, oh, haha, like, did you know in the West, they believe that you can change your gender? And like, everyone laughs, and he kind of uses this as like an audience trick. And so like, I wonder as well if we actually end up fueling this kind of sentiment by, you know, portraying these things as like some frivolous or like some exclusively left or some exclusively Western left thing that allows like leaders in other countries to ridicule it as a West thing rather than, you know, take seriously the struggles of LGBT people in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm. I mean, in a way, it kind of is a Western thing. I mean, the ideas around like homosexuality or like transgender identity emerged within a mostly Western European and like American and Canadian kind of like academia and intelligentsia. Not to say there wasn't discussions on sexuality and stuff like that in other places, but they didn't look the same because the material conditions and the culture and the entire history was so different. I mean, for example, like in the US, like you would consider like gay men to be like the most privileged of like the LGBT sphere. But if you go to places like Pakistan, that's not the case. People who are transgender or hijra, which are like their third gender identity, they have full legal rights and protections, and gay people don't. So it's like, oh, how is same for Iran? There is LGBT culture there, but it's like not treated the same way here. But we're led to believe, in the same way, things like gender and race, kind of we export it in the American outlook. We have to be like, oh, you must identify if you like men and you're a man, you're a gay. And but like Joseph Massad talks about this a lot, where like once you export the idea of homosexual or gay, you're also exporting the idea of being straight, because you have to have both. You can't have gays without having straight. It's like dialectics, like but it's like when you're exporting those ideas, in many ways you're like also importing the tools that can create homophobia, because you have an identity that is easier targetable. I think that's overlooked. We want to like just export our things because American culture and ideas are the best, but it's like, is that what the people there want, or what's best for the conditions? Or it's just
well, and we don't actually like export a lot of what we say we are, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like people saw that speech from Bashar al-Assad and said, oh, this is like all the more reason to continue our regime change campaign against him because he's anti-trans, right? So
yeah,
so
like as if ISIS
right, as if ISIS or Al Qaeda or here Al Sham or Hayat, whatever
HTS,
that shit is.
Yeah.
HTS is like, oh yeah, man, we're down with the trans folk, you know.
They're like snapping back at us.
So I want to know, Sam, because this is like maybe I should be asking this to a trans person. You know, I'm not totally. I think anyone should be able to speak to how they see things, regardless of their personal identity. But you know, you mentioned, and I forget the word, but I have read about them before. The people in Pakistan,
Hijra.
who, yeah. So I mean, this is one thing that I do push back on. When I agree that there's like a lot of excesses of I think what people have called the trans ideology, right? And I fully support trans rights. So just so nobody has any questions about that.
Yeah, yeah,
I know, right? But there are excesses. I think Dave Chappelle in his recent comedy Netflix special made a really solid point, which doesn't say that, you know, trans people shouldn't be able to have their government ID reflect their gender, right? On the other hand, he said Caitlyn Jenner had an easier time changing her gender than Cassius Clay had changing his name. So I think that there, you know, there's well, I mean, it's actually a fascinating viewing experience, even if I don't agree with some of the ways that he talks about certain issues. There was a lot to learn there. So one of the things I push back on when people talk about the excesses of trans ideology is this idea that it's like a new thing, right? Because it is very much an ancient thing, but it's also starting to get a lot more attention.
Mhm.
And I think a lot more people are trans today than used to be. I mean, would you agree with that? And what would you attribute that to? I know this is a tough question.
I know you're
Take
really
your time. Take your time.
for cancellation. To be fair, more people are queer today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's true. I think across the board, we've seen an increase in people identifying as lesbian, gay, queer, trans, bi, pan, whatever. So yeah, there's like a real thing. I think it's difficult to answer why. I think there's a lot of reasons. I think, for one, people need to define terms, and I think there needs to be actual debate. I think for so long, because we don't want to offend people, we don't allow people to actually challenge things coming from the queer theory or gender theory or feminism or whatever. But a lot of it's wrong. Like a lot of it, I'm a Marxist, so I don't agree with like postmodern views on it. I don't agree with the liberal views. But like, if you can't have any debate between different people within these groups, like to figure out what is the truth, you're not really going to get the answer solved. I think a lot of people also feel more alienated in society. So I think the more people identify with identities, which a lot of them seem to emerge more and more as capitalism compounds people's lives into like worse and worse quality. People find new ways to feel potentially connected to certain communities, and
which isn't to say that their experience is invalid or anything like that.
Yeah.
It's just it's contextual.
I mean,
yeah, and I think also right now there's this tendency to want to medicalize and like pathologize every single kind of behavior into like a sort of category. Like we see this with mental illness as well. You know, there's just all kind like, so now that's why like the acronym, like the LGBT acronym, or not like necessarily the acronym. I mean, it is growing, but there's also like,
which one? Yeah,
the Trudeau one. I don't know, but like, but you know, you have now like on the asexual spectrum, right? Like there's like, oh well, I sometimes feel attraction when this and sometimes I don't, and I'm thinking like you don't need like a medical or like identity
noun
term for this. Like you can just like, these are just your how you feel, which is like totally fine. And I actually worry that when we create identities out of behaviors that like we give potential to stigmatize those behaviors, or to again just like reify it and be like, yes, like I'm always this way, I'm always like, you know, I always only have sex in these conditions. Which you know is kind of, I actually don't think it's progressive. I think it's quite backwards. And
well, the most progressive sexuality is now only attracted to sex workers. That's
right.
Like the most progressive thing.
Yeah, Alex got in a bit of trouble today.
I'm just in awe. I don't even want to talk about it at this point because I'm just like I'm really worried about the left. I'll leave it at that. I'm extremely worried about the way that they're viewing this topic. And we have a whole episode on that, and I hope that people check that out.
Yeah, definitely.
But I'm gonna end our Periscope. I probably should have done that like 20 minutes ago, given where the conversation's gone. But on Rockfin, I want to talk to exclusively on Rockfin. I hope you guys join us there. It's rockfin.com/ProDemPod. I want to talk about the CIA with Sam next because
spicy.
They're quite woke. So I hope that you join us there, and thanks for watching. So Sam, you've seen these CIA ads. I have to figure out how to actually play video because last time I tried to, we had no audio, and I'd really like to be able to play those like CIA ads where, I mean, what was it like I forget what the. I'm sorry.
There was like a gay librarian, I believe, or like something.
Yeah, well, they had a few of the videos where there were different sexualities involved, and I just like because like I think the left still has this kind of view of the CIA that they're like very straight laced white guys, very generic looking,
or they view them as incompetent, but that's like. Or they view them as like these like stumbling, incompetent guys that just can never properly overthrow a country. Like that's like
yeah, but certainly like I think they don't view him as our stereotype of a so-called hot mess, right? Which seems to be what they're promoting in these recruitment videos. I don't know, Sam. What do you think about all that?
I mean, this is just the logic of where we're headed. I mean, I think people love to pretend that capitalism won't just fully take on like women or racial minorities or gays if they serve capitalism, and they totally will. Like we've seen this, like right now, the best, like almost every leader is fixating on what is their gender, what is their sexuality, what is their race, what is their mental illness, what's their disability. Like,
well, you have presidential candidates putting like she, her in their bio.
Oh my god, right? I hate that. Like, I think it's really stupid, but
yeah, I didn't know. I thought Kamala was a guy.
It was Warren, but she didn't put white lady.
Yeah, it was her and like Beto O'Rourke, and I think it was Beto O'Rourke. And what was the other one? There was one other one. It was a guy, and I'm like, we already know what your gender identity is. Like, I'm sorry. Like, was anyone confused what like Elizabeth Warren's gender terms were? Like, no.
It could be kind of butch. No.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I would have accepted that from Klobuchar.
Yeah.
But for this, I was gonna say for the CIA, I mean, they want to recruit these people. Like, I think there's an advantage now in the labor pool of a lot of these middle class, primarily gay and lesbian people who have the tools and are accepted now, so they can advance. But they also don't have like a lot of the things that lock down people from these roles, like gays and lesbians. They don't accidentally get pregnant. Like, that's all on their own. So like that gives you an instant like economic advantage in capitalism, because if you're not going to have babies or less likely to have babies, you're more likely just to keep working. So you can enter fields like NGOs and tech and things like, I don't know, the State Department, and you're going to be a cheerleader. Like, it's why all these industries that are highly lucrative and college educated tend to have a lot more LGBT people in their ranks, and like replicates things like, I don't know, mechanics or something like that. Coal mining.
That's a really good point, and I've actually never heard that before. So I actually really appreciate you mentioning that, because it's fascinating. One thing that I noticed from my own lived experience is that I used to live in New York City, and after I moved from New York City to Washington D.C. When I got on the subway in New York City with this haircut, I was the most normal looking dude on the subway. I got to DC and I was a fucking freak, right? Well, DC has the highest population of gay people of any city in the United States. But they like the way that people dress there, you would never know. Also, like along those lines, Raytheon is based there. Raytheon's like, consistently ranked the #1 place of employment for gay people, like consistently. So it's really interesting because like, now I live in Mexico City, and you see people with, that express themselves, for lack of a better term. I don't know if I'm phrasing this as exactly as I should, but there's not as many gay people per capita here. Same thing with New York. People express themselves. DC is just like I don't know. It's like Well, they call it Hollywood for ugly people, right? But they don't even dress the part. So I don't even know if that's a good term.
Yeah, I mean, I've been to like I just went to New York last week, and I've been to DC way too many times.
Oh, you poor bastard.
I also lived in San Francisco Bay Area for like 2 years, so like I've been to all these like gay areas. Yeah, DC is extremely high. Like I feel like every third man there's like gay or bi. You don't really find a lot of lesbians. Like I feel like they still get kind of screwed in the end. I mean, I can think of San Francisco where all of the gay scene was primarily like Asian and white gay men, and then you go to like poor areas which are still extremely expensive, like Oakland. And that's where the lesbians are, and like a lot of the Latino and Black gay scene is. It's highly segregated.
Yeah. In Montreal, actually, like where I was living for a while, they I remember they closed the last lesbian bar there. I had went to it, I think, in 2013, and then after that, that was it. And there wasn't there was like one little cafe, but the scene just kind of died. And that's kind of another hot button issue within the LGBT community. There's that whole theory that like less women are identifying with lesbian, like identifying as lesbian, and I'm kind of curious about that. Like, do you think that's like too spicy of a discourse?
I mean,
Well,
I think
we're exclusively on Rockfin now, so we can say whatever we want.
I love that. I mean, it probably is, but I know there was the whole discourse of people claiming it was lesbian women coming out as trans, which like may be the case for a few, but also like in the current research coming out, there's a lot more people identifying as bi. And I think for women, that's an area where that's more tolerable. I think there still is, despite like how woke America and like Canada have become, it's still kind of like, oh, if you like men, you just kind of fall into like the gay camp, which like is kind of, lame. It's kind of conservative in a way because it doesn't ever progress to the idea that maybe all of these labels are kind of silly and none of it actually matters, and you should just be able to like and be with who you want to be without having your entire identity strapped to it. Like, I don't know, that's my viewpoint, but for lesbians as well, I think a lot of either get like pushed around because they were more tied into the feminist sphere, and a lot of them tend to have viewpoints, especially in places like Britain and stuff, on things like gender identity and stuff that doesn't fit well with other segments of the LGBT sphere. So they kind of just get thrown to the side. I mean, gay men were already thrown to the side because like they're men, so they're already advantaged. So
yeah. Well, I mean, like I brought up the theory just because I saw it was, causing a huge stir. I don't know how much of it I really buy into, just because I think there's also, I think, but I mean, this should be the case for men, but maybe if you're like, maybe there's just a different culture involved with like queer men versus queer women. But like, I know with like women, it's like if you're bi, there's such a huge pressure to like date a man and get married to a man that it's like if you're bi, you still have that door open to you, whereas if you're lesbian, you don't. So I don't know. I think it could also be due to like compulsory heterosexuality, but it's just I did see it making a big sort of wave. I saw Glenn Greenwald getting in trouble for it.
You could also, like, I don't have facts behind this, but I feel like for a lot of men who may fall into like maybe they are bi or whatever, might slide more towards the gay thing just because in a lot of corporations and jobs now, maybe that is a slight advantage if you're like the white man from a well-off background. If you're gay, many like high-end companies ask your sexuality now and your gender, and that can give you a bump, that can give you a boost. It can make you stick out and feel more special, where maybe you're not attacked as much, or you're not just viewed as like you're not generic, you're not average. And today everyone has to feel special. So like that's their thing. So it's like, yeah.
No, it's totally, and it's kind of weird to me that companies are asking people's sexuality. It seems like a sort of invasion of privacy.
I think some states might ban that.
Yeah,
they should.
Yeah.
Actually, funny story. I was I think I remember this because before I got into journalism, I canvassed for Human Rights Campaign. So I think that was like one of their things, is that they didn't want companies asking your sexual identity. Hilarious, because like people like it was, because this is like supposed to be like a, you know, Human Rights Campaign. It's like the top gay rights lobby in the United States. But if you didn't meet quotas for 2 weeks in a row, as far as like how many people you got to give Human Rights Campaign money every week on the street randomly, you know, they train you, you know, you have to wave with a big wave and smile and follow the script 100%, no deviation. But if you didn't make your quotas for 2 weeks in a row, you just like got fired. And like the minimum, it was like it was minimum wage plus like a commission, but the commission was like it's really difficult to get people to just be like I remember the opening line we had to wave, smile, and say, "Hi there, do you support gay rights?" You know? And then, okay, this is why you should give us $15 a month. So it's really awful labor practices, very precarious job, low paying too.
Yeah, I find there's a lot of like human rights industry stuff that does that. I had totally not related to our conversation, but I'd recently seen a job posting that was like for law students, and it was like mental health advocate or whatever, and then it's like unpaid internship.
Yeah.
So like, you know, economic precarity doesn't have a relationship with like mental health.
I'm gonna do this tweet after our podcast. You know that those red flags people have been putting up.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just gonna put in quotes: human rights, red flag, red flag, red flag.
Yeah, it's. I mean, it really seems like a way of like I've made this joke before that, like, you know, conservatives in the US want to be the policemen of the world, like neocons, and libs want to be the human resources department of the world.
That's good, yeah.
And it kind of does seem like that. I'm also, you know, curious to talk about Russia a little bit, because I know Sam has done a lot of research on Slavic countries. I had him on my old show to talk about Yugoslavia, but there's been a lot of I do recall there was an attempt to cancel the Russian hosting the Olympics because of like their repression of gay people there. Is that a thing there, or like how does what's happening match up with the Western narrative?
Yeah, so prior to the Sochi Olympics, the Putin government passed the bill, which basically prohibited what they call like gay or like gay propaganda to minors. So you still had like gay clubs and like all that stuff in Moscow and St. Petersburg. You just couldn't, you know, do things in public that would be invisible to children, that would be considered propaganda. And I think it's horrible. And I think you see in polls a lot more young people, and even the general Russian population have kind of shifted stances as they've kind of recuperated after the massive austerity of the 90s, because like income and education all collaborate with acceptance of other people. Shocking, I know. But basically, once that passed, you had in the US, for example, gay bars pouring out like vodka and stuff, and like in protest of Russia I think a lot of it wasn't even Russian vodka. And they were actually like companies that like supported.
We don't sell actual Russian vodka in the U.S. Like,
yeah,
I mean, I haven't had I had a Russian friend who was moving, and he like threw a party where he had actual Russian vodka. That shit's delicious. It's smooth. Yeah. You don't even realize you're drinking alcohol. It's nothing like any vodka that I've ever experienced elsewhere in the U.S. But go on. I'm sorry.
Yeah. But basically that went through, and basically it was obsessed like, Putin hates gay people. But in interviews, I think he's more like most Russians, kind of like, I don't really care. Like they'll say I'm neutral. They're like, I don't really care. Like as long as they want you to keep it in your private life, which to Western people that's considered oppression, but to a lot of more conservative cultures, that's like the best you're probably gonna get for a while. I mean, also like Putin's part of the United Russia Party, which is like the largest political party there, which means he has a broad non-ideological base, which includes the Russian Orthodox Church. So he kind of has to appease to the more right-wing elements and maintain power, but also handle like the more liberal, progressive mindsets in the upper echelon society in like Moscow and St. Petersburg. I mean, we see this in like Syria, where like they have like, oh, we'll keep a Muslim person as like president to appease like the more conservative elements. It's kind of like that, where they have to like recognize like, well, if I don't give them anything, they're gonna like lose their shit and like kick me out. So I think that was kind of the compromise. We also don't hear about all the like positive things. Like there was a trans woman on like a major Russian magazine. You have more acceptance among youth who are like, I'm neutral or accepting.
It's funny because the liberal line on Putin is that he hates the gays, but at the same time he was topping Trump.
Right.
You know?
Hot.
What's that, Mila?
I said hot, but
yeah.
Not really. I mean, Putin's hot, but not Trump. So
no.
It's a hot wife, so they can, you know.
Yeah.
You were so fucking canceled.
I guess.
No, so it's funny. Sam and I have talked about how like Melania and Asma Assad are like gay icons.
Totally. Yeah.
Asma had
Mila, you're just like begging for the Daily Beast to do a hit job on you, aren't you?
I'm really not. I'm so innocent and good.
No, I gotta hear about this Melania and
Asma. Yeah, well, she had a Vogue article that we found.
So good.
Yeah, no.
I gotta hear this.
Oh yeah,
what was the Vogue article?
There was like this. I can't tell if Sam's talking.
Oh no, go ahead. I'm just waiting for you to talk.
Yeah, there was a Vogue article about her that like got pulled, but it was very like fashion icon. Like she looked really gorgeous in it, and like I think it talked about how like she also like is like her own woman, and she has like a master's degree in
computer science.
Yeah, something like that. But they pulled it. No, it's not on there anymore. I gotta hand it to her. Like she is very pretty.
Yeah.
Definitely too pretty for Bashar.
That's true.
He's not the most handsome guy, but he is a smart guy. And I mean he really is. His English is actually pretty good. I think better than people give him credit for. I'll leave it at that. I'm not going to say anything good about him, but he is smart. Whatever you think, you have to be smart to be able to stay in power after all that shit. Saddam couldn't do it. Gaddafi couldn't do it.
That's
I guess they had a no-fly zone in Libya, so it's a bit different. But
it's like when your opponents are that unsavory, like it's the same. Though it's funny because I was thinking like the Democrats have like the dumbest opponents and they still like lose or don't none. So I guess it's kind of he's better than the Democrats in that regard.
He's not like a puppet like Biden is right now, or just like him eating ice cream, talking about like teapot or whatever.
Is Biden alive?
I feel like he's like just like being glued together. He's like falling apart.
We should have opened the show with there's that Biden clip where he says like, "Coach, I'm gay."
I haven't seen that.
Oh, it's so good.
I'll try and pull it up, but it's really funny.
There's a good collab where it's like before the COVID jab, and it's like him talking about like marriage between a man and a woman, and then after the jab, and he's like, "I'm gay."
Can we get like a Biden corn pop fanfic like gay thing?
No,
I want to see that.
I feel like it already exists, but like that's already
Probably
like, the booty judges because
true. Yeah, well, that's something else that we've talked about, or actually, I don't know if they had their child from surrogacy, but we've also talked about surrogacy a little bit as a issue in the LGBT community, and I think like that's also another thing that could connect to imperialism as well. But before I get to, was Buttigieg's kid like, were those surrogate made?
No, I thought they'd adopted.
They weren't really
I could be wrong.
But like it's pretty rare to get twins. So, and surrogacy, which is IVF usually, has a much higher rate of like multiple children at once. So like I think they tried to adoption. And there was this interview of Chase and me like heartbroken the woman decided to keep her own baby.
Oh.
I get, but I'm also like, to me that's kind of cringe. Cause like I'm like, I feel like that's the ideal. Like a woman deciding to keep her baby. Like, I don't know. I think that's good. But I think they're voted to surrogacy because that's just more reliable. They're not poor, so.
You find that clip, Mila?
Yeah, I sent it to you in the private.
Oh well, let me see if I can figure out how to play it because this is.
Yeah, this is a great take. Yeah, well, I guess like yeah, you should definitely put that clip on first though.
You sent it to me on Twitter?
No, on StreamYard chat.
Ah, shit. Well, I exposed my DMs.
It's literally.
I don't have it.
Okay, well.
I don't have it.
Okay.
I wonder if we can cut that out because I exposed my DMs, but.
Oh
well.
Yeah.
It's just me talking shit about Hassan.
Perfect. Yeah. Well, okay, like my final thing that I wanted to discuss then was like we've talked a lot about how there's been, this use of like LGBT and human rights language to sort of rationalize the imperial core, and their dominance, their global hegemony. We see this in the CIA. We've seen this against like Iran. We've seen this against Cuba and so on. And I'm wondering your thoughts, Sam, on how, because clearly, like, there are lots of LGBT people who are anti-imperialist, and how can they approach and combat this problem?
I mean, I think for starters, we need to focus on what like the main issue facing society, which is the war between like the vast majority, which is workers, and like the ruling class, and try and raise the living standards in a lot of these places. Because we know from research, if you allow countries to invest in education and you allow people to have boosts in things like gender equality and economic performance, that tolerance becomes greater across the board. I think we need to stop trying to like just attack the culture, which is usually like focus on like religion when it's other countries like Islam or Christianity or something. But But like those ideas tend to dominate because the conditions are so precarious while we're like sanctioning them. I think in the US where it's already like pretty equal, I mean, not perfectly, but pretty equal, I think we kind of need to like resist falling into like obsession with sexual and gender politics. I think across the board, fixating on it too much only serves to keep people entrapped in discussions that lead to no outcomes that benefit the majority. Like the issue is like class. Like it's not gays versus straight people or like trans people versus like non-trans people or I don't know, gays versus bi.
I think the word is cis.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know about that, but sorry.
But I think that's the thing. Like we need to kind of like say like this served its purpose, but it doesn't really serve a purpose really anymore. I know it's gonna upset people. But like the key things that everyone needs are the things that most LGBT people are already advocating for, but we can build broad alliances for things like housing, like healthcare, job, right to a job. Like those are all the things that I think matter. And then the rest of LGBT rights tends to just like serve bourgeois imperialist interests. And we shouldn't align with that. Like HRC and all these like big gay NGOs, they're not gay people's friends. They actively work against it because they support people like the Clintons and the Bidens, and if you're on the right wing, the Trumps, while like getting funding money to like Saudi Arabia and stuff. Like, I'm sorry, like if you're supporting a war party that boosts like some of the worst countries in the world for gay people, like you're not on the side of gay people or anyone for the matter. You're the enemy. You're the baddie.
Well, it's interesting too because like I think that gay rights have come a long way, right? At the same time, there's still like more that could be done, right? Like a lot of states can still fire you if you're gay. Mm-hmm. That's legal, but nobody talks about that. Instead, all the gay activism is like, oh, such and such celebrity made a microaggression, you know?
Yeah.
This rapper said this. Let's ruin his life.
The baby.
You know? Yeah, exactly. Whereas like there's like actual issues still. I mean, of course it's nowhere near as bad as it used to be, but there's still improvements that could be made to our legal system in regards to gay rights, but nobody talks about that. I don't see that shit on Twitter. Do you guys? I don't talking about employment discrimination.
Yeah, I don't see a lot of talk about employment rights in general
or housing discrimination. I mean,
yeah, but
maybe it's not like a common thing, but like legally it's allowed in a lot of states. So I feel like that should be fixed, right?
I mean, if anything, you see labor discussions where you use LGBT rights to fire workers for having like more reactionary or conservative views on gender or something. They said something on Twitter, and that's like from 2014 or whatever. And like, I'm sorry, I don't think anyone should be fired as long as they're like actually doing their job. Like if they said on the job, like maybe then sure, like you can't call people like horrible slurs, but like I don't think people should starve to death. Like that's where it kind of resorts down to for a lot of this discussion when it comes to labor. How do we?
Is it going to make people like less homophobic if you fire them? Like
no.
Yeah.
So how can anti-imperialists communicate with the gay community on these things?
And there's overlap, obviously.
Yeah.
Of course. Please don't cancel me.
Yeah.
I need to eat. Like, I have 3 dogs.
Sam has like 2 internal.
I don't think if I want to answer. So like I don't think anti-imperialists should target the gay demographic because I think it's pandering. Honestly, I think you can just say the things you believe, and I think they'll reminisce with people regardless of where they are on the sexuality spectrum. Like, I mean, sure, you have people like, oh, well, what about like Palestine and Tel Aviv Pride? But like, that's where you actually learn the issues and the reality. And she will like explain, well, here's why this Israel has Tel Aviv Pride, because it's funded by the Israeli state and the IDF is part of it to seem woke so they can legitimate the suppression of Palestinian people controlled by Hamas, which was created by Israel. Like, that's how you say it. But people wanted to be like, well, socialism's the only way you're going to be free. I'm like, well, there's plenty of gay people doing great under capitalism. Like, we don't need to pander. Like, it's kind of like, yeah, I don't like that. Like, people are smart enough and they don't need to be targeted. And also, like, if you're targeting like people in the LGBT activism sphere, most likely they're never going to side with you because they tend to be the same cheerleaders for imperialist causes because they're like deeply rooted in the like political machine.
Yeah, totally. I think that's a good point too. I've kind of noticed that kind of trend in activism circles where like they just propose one thing as like the solve all for like every single kind of like marginalized group, where it's like, yeah, well, once like you can't like fix this without overthrowing this. And it kind of treats like homophobia as though it impacts everyone in the same way, when obviously it doesn't. Especially, you know, if you have secure access to housing, it's going to impact you quite a bit differently. Like if you're, you know, in another insecure housing situation. So I think, yeah, it really depends on the circumstance. And I think it's good that we're able to sort of bring that out.
I think also like if you really want to more target, like let's say you are like at a pride thing and you want to call out like imperialism, I think the best thing you can do is offer the counter narrative that's not being reported from the big gay like corporations and NGOs and politicians. Like I think of Syria, and there's this really like good Harper Bazaar piece, and it's basically about a gay Syrian soldier explaining life before the regime change proxy war and after, and basically explaining life wasn't great per se in like cities, but like in Damascus, there were bars where gays hung out, and there was a tour group of like run by this guy who would take gay visitors. This visited like predominantly gay visited areas in like Damascus and Latakia, and I didn't get pronounced that wrong. I don't know. But like, and now it's like that's all gone. And he ended up realizing like it's even still dangerous there because a lot of the gay soldiers there were still being especially targeted by like Al-Qaeda forces and Muslim Brotherhood forces. So there's double targets. I mean, and also the country wasn't getting better at the time when it was written. So I think that kind of in a person story, like, oh, you want to carpet bomb like Libya to free the gays? Like, are you really helping the gays, or are you making life worse for them? Because maybe life wasn't great before, but you never asked them like the true comparison they want. Like, that's probably not what they wanted.
Yeah,
I think it's you know, like a they say a rising tide raises all ships. Well, it, you know, draining it would, or you know, well, you see what I'm saying. I apologize. I'm not very eloquent tonight, but you know, if you overall lower the living standards of a society by doing a regime change, then gay people are going to suffer. And if you try to improve the society, then naturally their situation will improve. So I think that's I think that's the way to do it, rather than hyper focusing on the LGBT struggle, which in a lot of ways only kind of heightens the internal contradictions, cultural contradictions of that society, which makes the situation worse. So do either of you guys have anything that you want to add?
I just want to thank Sam for coming on.
Yeah, Sam's the best. Follow him on Twitter. It's at TwinkRevSam. Follow it. What's the website? Twinkrev.com? Twinkrev.
I mean, the website's still up.
Twink.
It's called at TwinkRev on Twitter for podcasts. And then if you want to listen to our podcast, we're on all good places where podcasts are streamed. And just type in Twink Revolution and have a listen.
It is a great podcast. It's one of the podcasts I listen to regularly. It's like funny, it has good insights, good guests, and people should definitely listen to it. Shout out to Gian, who's cannot be here tonight, but that's definitely also a good addition. And Sam has some articles on the website that are also pretty good and touch on some of the stuff we talked about tonight. There's one on Tel Aviv Pride that I remembered reading that was pretty good.
There's a Queer Eye one where I attacked
Yeah, you attacked them.
Yeah.
I wish I hadn't just closed out the episode. I want to hear that.
I wrote a piece on Queer Eye and explained why it's actually bad, and it's kind of a metaphor for like the upper like PMCs trying to destroy the working class. And it's funny because Megan Day from was it Current Affairs or Jacobin? She wrote her celebrating it. It's like, this is what we want for everyone. And people kept posting my article underneath hers. Yeah. And she blocked Twink Rev. So
she is a fountain of bad takes.
Yeah. So cringe.
That sounds like a good one. That one, and the Tel Aviv Pride one was good. I have been definitely I've gotten in trouble on Twitter for talking about Pride in the Middle East, so it was a ballsy move. Respect. So thank you so much, Sam, for coming on. And everyone should definitely check out these articles and Twink Revolution. And that's that. We'll see you guys next week.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks, everyone, for watching.